January 6th, 2007. They were just heading to a friend's party. Channon was a sociology student with dreams of helping others. Chris was a carpenter who made her laugh like crazy. Neither knew that 5 predators were watching them kissing in the parking lot, waiting to turn their date night into an unimaginable nightmare. Within hours, Chris's body would be found burned by the railroad tracks. Days later, they found Channon left in a trash can. This brutally shocked even hardened detectives and had several professionals in tears during sentencing. What some people do for fun is simply disgusting. By the end of this case, you'll be questioning humanity, but we need to tell their story. We need to promise to look after each other in this strange world. Texts going unanswered, calls going straight to voicemail. Something's wrong, Gary Christian thought. Channon never missed work. Never. She was reliable and responsible, and she'd always let her parents know if she was spending the night somewhere else. Mary and Hugh Newsom felt it too. Even though Chris was 23 and independent, a gnawing worry took hold when he didn't come home. He wasn't the type to leave several calls unreturned.
The way we discovered he was missing was Shannon's mother, Dina, called and said that Channon didn't show up for work.
Both families began calling friends. Where were they last seen? Who saw them last? The apartment complex? Washington Ridge? Around 9 p.m. Saturday. By Monday, panic set in. Channon's mom contacted police but faced that all too familiar response for missing adults. It's only been 48 hours. But these families weren't waiting. They organized search parties, called cell phone companies, and pinged all locations their kids had been to. Cherry Street area, the cell company said. That was a street neither of the families had heard of. It didn't make sense, but they had to explore it until it did. At 2 a.m. Monday morning, through sheer determination, Channon's parents and friends found her Toyota 4Runner, abandoned, cleaned out. The seats pushed far back, too far for Channon's petite frame to have driven it. Cigarettes in the console. Channon didn't smoke. It was a parent's worst nightmare materializing in real time. But worse, much worse, was coming. A railroad worker made the horrific discovery on Sunday afternoon. A body, male, young, burned nearly beyond recognition, naked, tied, and thrown on the tracks for trains to finish the job. Detective Snodderly broke the news to the Newsoms.
Detective Snodderly says it's Chris. And we asked, well, how do you know? And he says, I recognized him by his eyes. Everything fell apart at that moment.
The next moments unfolded in a blur of grief. Nearly 20 of Chris's closest friends arrived together at the Newsom home. Mary felt an icy chill watching them gather without her son among them, and she was yet to find out how she'd lost her son.
All of his friends walked in. There must have been 15 or 20 of them come in all at the same time, and that just gave me such an eerie feeling. So I thought, why isn't Chris with them? And it really put chills through me. I thought, here's all his friends and he's not here.
Meanwhile, the desperate search for Channon continued. Her family clung to diminishing hope with each passing hour. Then Gary's phone rang with cryptic, haunting news about activity near the trash place on Chipman Street. The police followed a forensic trail of fingerprints found in Channon's abandoned 4Runner and swatted the house Tuesday. In the kitchen of that Chapman Street home, police found horror. Channon's body into a garbage can. Not placed, not left, stuffed. Her eyes still open, a final testimony to what she'd endured. The garbage can, the kitchen floor, the casual cruelty of it. Investigators, hardened by years on the force, stood speechless at the scene. Some had to step outside to refrain from crying. Channon had been alive for hours after Chris died. The medical examiner who would later confirm what this meant. Hours of pain and terror, hours when she might not be saved. Soon enough, the community would learn that this young couple was and tortured to death by complete strangers right under their noses. That's what left the community in tatters, that this could happen to anyone, and that if they knew, they could have saved them.
We were 2 blocks from where she was. If they'd have just knocked on the door, walked the streets, we don't know if we could have saved her life, but she wouldn't have sat there for 2 days in a trash can.
The weight of that nearness became another wound. Chris and Channon had futures planned, college graduation, careers, maybe marriage. All of it erased in one violent night. All of it stolen by strangers who saw them as nothing but targets, who were a little annoyed by their love. A community that once felt safe now looked at their neighbors differently, locked doors that used to stay open, made phone calls to check on loved ones who were just minutes late. Knoxville had changed forever. Before they were victims, they were Channon and Chris, young, dreamy, and deeply in love. Channon Christian, 21, a sociology senior at the University of Tennessee, a 2003 Fagrin High School graduate with an engaging smile that lit up rooms. She would have turned 40 this April.
She was beautiful, but what made her even more beautiful was the fact that she was not stuck on herself.
That humility defined her. Despite her striking looks and natural charisma, Channon remained grounded, accessible, and genuine. She carried her dreams lightly but purposefully.
She loved life, that's for sure.
Her sociology studies weren't just about earning a degree. Channon wanted to understand people, to help those struggling, and to leave her corner of the world better than she found it.
She cared about people.
Classmates remember her asking the difficult questions in discussions and showing a depth of empathy that promised she would have excelled in whatever path she chose. Christopher Newsom, at 23, had already established himself as someone who created beauty with his hands. He was a talented carpenter, and he built things meant to last, crown molding that still adorns Knox County homes today. After graduating from Halls High School in 2002 and attending Philippi State, Chris had found his calling in a trade that matched his meticulous nature. Baseball had been his first love. On the field for Halls High, his natural athleticism had made him a standout pitcher and outfielder. But what everyone remembers the most about Chris was that warm openness that drew people to him.
Anybody that knew Chris was his friend, and he had a smile that everybody just loved.
Chris was an excellent baseball player. Good boy, good kid, worked hard, had a lot of skills. Could have went on and played further if he'd have chose to.
Channon and Chris had only been dating for about 2 months before their murders. They'd met in November 2006, but those who knew them saw something special blossoming.
Channon was a beautiful girl, and Chris was just carried away with her. I mean, he really liked her. You can tell with those pictures.
And the joy you could see on their faces is pure joy to be together.
I think he had finally found a girl that he was really interested in, and I think they would have got married.
A love story with no chance to unfold. Two paths merging only to be violently cut short. The Newsoms and Christians are growing older, wondering what could have been.
What would he be today? We'll never know.
What began as a carjacking quickly spiraled into something far more sadistic. 5 perpetrators, Lamarcus Davidson, Levaltis Cobbins, George Thomas, Eric Boyd, and Vanessa Coleman. Davidson, the 25-year-old ringleader, had been recently released from prison from carjacking. Cobbins was his half-brother. The couple was forced at gunpoint to get into Channon's 4Runner and taken to Davidson's rental home on Chipman Street. What happened next is almost too brutal to describe.
They raped him, they tortured him, they beat him, then they killed him.
Chris was meticulously from the moment they entered that house. His attackers took turns not just striking him, but methodically breaking him. Court testimony later revealed how he fought back initially, desperately trying to protect Channon, even as multiple assailants overwhelmed him. They bound his hands so tight that the restraints cut into his skin. The was prolonged, deliberate, and calculated to degrade. Multiple perpetrators participated while others watched. Medical examiners would later document extensive injuries that indicated Chris had been violated repeatedly over hours, all while he could hear Channon's screams from another room, powerless to reach her. All while those monsters promised they would do the same to her once they were done with him. When they finally dragged him from the house, Chris was barefoot. In January, the railroad tracks weren't far, just far enough that neighbors wouldn't hear the gunshots. They left nothing to chance. Bound his ankles, wrapped his hands, stuffed a sock deep into his mouth so no final words could escape. They covered his head with his own sweatshirt, tying it around his neck with shoelaces, ensuring his final moments would be in suffocating darkness. The first bullet tore through his neck, not immediately fatal. The second pierced his back. Still, his heart kept beating. The third, style to his head, finally accomplished what the others couldn't. Then, as if this brutality wasn't enough, they doused his broken body with gasoline. The flames erased physical evidence, but created a horrific final image for the railroad worker who would discover him the next day. While Chris's suffering had ended, Channon's nightmare continued for another day. 24 hours when rescue could have come, but didn't. The medical examiner would later testify that her injuries showed a pattern of escalating torture, as though her captors grew more vicious as time passed. Multiple attackers SA'd her repeatedly. The assaults were so violent, they caused internal damage, documented in excruciating detail at the trial. Details that made family members leave the courtroom. Between assaults, she was in what prosecutors called an attempt to destroy evidence. Her attackers poured bleach down her throat and on her privates, killing her from the inside. The bleach in her mouth likely left her unable to scream or plead as the hours dragged on. When they finally decided to end her life, they didn't grant her the relative mercy of a bullet. Instead, they hog-tied her with strips torn from bedding, binding her so tightly that her circulation was cut off. They wrapped her still breathing body in 5 separate garbage bags. They covered her head with an additional bag, sealing it around the neck. Then they stuffed her into a trash can in the kitchen. Forensic evidence confirmed the most haunting detail. Channon was still alive when they put her in that trash can. She suffocated slowly over hours, fighting for each breath inside those layers of plastic. She died with her eyes open, a detail that still gives nightmares to the first responders. In the courtroom, both families endured a second trauma. They cried, screamed, and left the room repeatedly to gather themselves. Police officers who had worked homicides for decades testified that they had never seen anything like it. Prosecutors with years of experience handling violent crimes struggled to maintain composure while presenting evidence. The medical examiner, whose profession requires emotional distance, paused several times while detailing the injuries too. She was close to tears. Physical evidence led police directly to the killers. Fingerprints in the abandoned 4Runner, DNA evidence at the scene, Channon's belongings scattered throughout the Chipman Street house. Within days of discovering the bodies, police had arrested all 5 suspects. Davidson and Boyd were captured immediately, while Thomas, Cobbins, and Coleman were found hiding in Kentucky. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA from both Davidson and Cobbins was found on Channon's body. The couple's possessions were recovered from the suspects.
They were always unstable and they were always into something. And I do believe firmly, and some of the people that I run along with, that when you practice a lot of deceit and when you're involved in a lot of things like that, it's going to catch up with you. And I think it caught up with them.
This wasn't a crime of opportunity gone wrong. This was prolonged, deliberate cruelty. The kind that has people question humanity and lose trust in others. Investigators never found a solid motive beyond stealing Channon's SUV. But this was so much more than stealing a car. These were predators. They saw a happy young couple sharing a moment of affection and something snapped. Maybe it was jealousy. Maybe it was pure evil. Maybe it was the twisted thrill of destroying something beautiful just because they could. Whatever drove them, they just didn't want Channon's car. They wanted to take everything from 2 people who had everything they didn't: love, a future, and hope. Davidson was sentenced to death and remains on death row in Nashville.
The punishment is death.
Cobbins received life without parole. Thomas was initially sentenced to life without parole, but later had his sentence reduced to 50 years as a part of a plea deal. Coleman, who was dating Cobbins at the time, was sentenced to 53 years, later reduced to 35 years. She was only 18 at the time of the killings.
How old would she be? 70?
Too old to have kids, that's for sure.
At least she can't multiply.
Boyd, though initially only convicted as an accessory, was later tried for murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 90 years. But the legal journey wasn't straightforward. In 2011, Judge Richard Bogmonter stepped down after it was discovered he was a drugs. Sadly, this triggered retrials for Thomas and Coleman. The Christian and Newsom families would endure 8 criminal trials in total. For years, the Newsom family fought to bring Boyd to justice for what they believed was his direct role in their son's murder.
Well, I just had a gut feeling that Eric Boyd was the one that killed him. And I wasn't going to let Eric get away with it.
When Boyd was finally convicted in 2019, Mary Newsom remembers,
when they said guilty, I cried. I was so happy that I just cried. And when he walked out of that courtroom, he turned to me and he said, "I'll get you." And I thought, "No, buddy, I got you. You know, you're not going to get me now."
The murders of Channon and Chris terrified Knoxville and everyone reading about it. The community's sense of security shattered overnight.
I have a daughter, and I wouldn't want as a result of that whole thing, I'm checking up on her every day.
What made this case particularly terrifying for the community was the pure randomness. These weren't kids from troubled backgrounds. They weren't in a dangerous neighborhood. They weren't taking risks. They were just being young and in love, what should have been a safe place. This could have been anyone. The safety that Knoxville residents had taken for granted vanished overnight.
I think a lot of people don't believe that things like that can happen here to them, and when they realize that, you know, there's monsters among us, they're coming in here, they want some protection. They want to know what to do to keep that from happening to them or their kids.
The community responded with fear and then action. Gun permit applications flooded in. People who had never even considered owning firearms suddenly felt vulnerable without protection. Within months, hundreds of local residents were armed who had never been before. Parents implemented strict check-in rules with their teenagers. Women signed up for self-defense classes that filled to capacity. Journalists refused to cover this case and chose different careers. Some people tried to spin it as a racially motivated crime.
I have heard that there's been some people that have talked about how it was a racially motivated crime, and I think that it's a bad thing because that just creates more racism and intolerance and strife in the community.
A community changed forever, not just grieving 2 lost lives, but mourning the loss of innocence and security that would never fully return. The Chipman Street house has since been demolished, but for the Christian and Newsom families, there is no true healing, only coping, learning to live with an emptiness that can never be filled. Mary Newsom remembers a conversation with Chris just 2 weeks before his death. He had sold his beloved motorcycle.
And he called me one afternoon and said, "Mom, I've sold my bike." And I said, "You have, Chris?" I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Because I want a life." And that just haunts me now that he said that, and 2 weeks later, here he is dead.
The families have channeled their grief into action. They've created foundations and scholarships in Channon and Chris's names. The Chris Newsom Memorial Baseball Tournament is held every spring. Over the years, the Newsom Foundation has awarded 42 scholarships to Hall High's high school students. The Channon Christian Foundation, established in 2009, provides scholarships to female Frogrant High School graduates attending the University of Tennessee. It's since expanded to students from Knox and surrounding counties. Most of the money is raised in a golf tournament held every year, Channon's favorite sport. In 2014, Governor Bill Howsam signed the Chris Newsom and Channon Christian Acts into law. Chris's bill ends the practice of the 13th juror, which had required a judge to sign a unanimous verdict. Channon's bill prevents attorneys from using allegations from a victim's past if those allegations aren't relevant to the case. The senseless murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom revealed both the worst and best of humanity. The unspeakable cruelty contrasted with the unwavering love of families who refused to let their children's memories fade.
We've got a whole bunch of cards from people that don't know us, that just have to say something and want to say something, that they're praying for us, and there's been an awful lot of support that we really appreciate.
Every year, the Knoxville community gathers to remember Channon and Chris, to light candles, to share stories, to keep their spirits alive. Their deaths changed how a community views safety and how the legal system functions. But more importantly, their lives continue to inspire through scholarships, foundations, and acts of remembrance. For Gary Christian, his last exchange with his daughter remains a treasured memory.
I said, "All right, baby, be careful, and I love you more." And she said, "No, I love you more."
and I heard her come back towards the front door. And when she went out the door, she said, "I love you more," and slammed the door. So she won that battle.
Channon and Chris may be gone, but through the tireless efforts of their families and communities, they will never be forgotten. Their story reminds us of the preciousness of life, the importance of holding our loved ones close, and the power of love to transcend even the darkest tragedy.
Just always remember to tell your children that you love them, your family that you love them, because you never know when it's going to be the last time that you get to say those words.
The murder of Channon Christian and Chris Newsom forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. How can people who look like our neighbors harbor such darkness? Where was the system when these young people needed protection the most? Why do we only implement safety measures after tragedies occur? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations matter. They honor Channon and Chris by ensuring their story continues to protect others. If this case moved you, please like and subscribe to my channel. Stay safe, hold your loved ones close, and remember that in sharing these difficult stories, we create a community that refuses to look away from injustice.